Recording in progress.
Okay, today's daf we're going to learn is Beitzah Kaftet. Today's daf is sponsored by Chana Hashkis in memory of her mother-in-law, Chaya Sarah, Sally Bat Genya, and Mordechai Rubin on her birthday, which was Simchat Torah outside of Israel. She was active in supporting women's Torah learning throughout her life. Today's learning will be in her memory. Okay, we are going to now start from the bottom of Kafchet Amud Bet. So we might have finished with all the Chagim right now, but we're still learning all about Chagim for another few weeks. So we have Lo Yomar. We're trying to figure out how can people, right? Remember, we had this idea. People went to stores on Yom Tov, right? Hard to imagine for our purposes, but people will go to stores. The question is, how are you allowed to purchase things? In what way? You have to be careful with how you speak, what words you say. You have to make sure not to mention certain things that will make it appear like a business interaction or make it appear like something or do it in the normal way that you do it on a weekday. So therefore, we saw in the Mishnah, we'll kind of read it again, the bottom of Kafchet Amud Bet. Lo yomar adam letabach shkoli bedinar basar, aval shochet umechalek benehem. You can't say, weigh for me a X amount of money's worth of meat, but you slaughter it and you divide it among the people without kind of making mention of money. There's a big question about how this Mishnah works with the Mishnah on Kaf Zayin Amud Bet that we already saw. They said you can't go together on an animal, Yom Tov, but you can decide from before Yom Tov, and then Shochtinu Mechalkim Benehem, which is the same language here, Shochetu Mechalek Benehem. So what exactly the difference is between this Mishnah and the other Mishnah is a big source of debate. I'm not going to go into the different answers because the truth is the question was better than all the answers that I found. But you should know that there's a question how exactly this Mishnah is different from that one. So how do you do it then? Again, it's all a matter of linguistics. So what do they say? Well, it depends where you live and what language they use in the place that you live. And this, again, becomes problematic for us as the reader and for all the commentaries for all intents and purposes because the lingo that they used here was very familiar to them and they knew exactly what the differences were and what they were referring to. We, of course, coming later, don't really know what they mean here. So Besur, we're going to see in different cities, this is the way they would say it when they would go shopping on Yom Tov. They would say, Amru tarta upalgu, Amru tarta upalgu tarta. They would say, give me a tarta or a half a tarta. Benarish Amre chalka upalga chalka, give me a part or half of a part. In other words, a chalka wasn't just a part, but it meant some sort of size. Bepubedita Amre uzia upalga uzia, another language of some sort of way they would say it there. Again, each time they're going to say a word and then part of that word, right, like half of that. Benahar Pakoda, B'matza Machasya, other two cities, Amre Riva upalga Riva. This is the one that's the most familiar to us, which is a quarter or half of a quarter. So again, there's a debate among the commentaries what these all mean. Some people say that they mean these are measurements. Okay, they're not, again, you can't say money, but you could say, I want a quarter of an animal, or a part of a quarter, or whatever it was, using measurements. Some people say that these were utensils. I want this full. I want a tarta full of, a plate's worth of meat, or half a plate's worth, or something like that. Maybe it was more talking about the utensil and not the measurement of the meat. Okay. Getting into more now. Measuring and how you would go into a store and ask for a certain amount of something. So in the Mishnah it now says, Omer Adam lechavero, you can say to your friend, really it seems to mean like someone selling to you, Malei li klize, fill me up, I want you to fill me up with oil into this utensil, aval lo b'midah, but not a measuring utensil. Okay, we're going to have to see. It's not exactly clear. It's hard for me to translate this Mishnah because the Gemara is going to have two different explanations as to how to read this Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Imaya kli shel midah lo yimalena. If it was a kli that was used for measuring, right? We all in our houses, we have measuring cups, and then we have cups that we use for drinking or for putting other things in. So what Rabbi Yehuda says is you can't use a clay of midah, kli for measuring, to fill it up with. Which sounded like what Tanakama was saying. Because Tanakama says you could say, fill me up with this utensil, but not bimidah, it sounded like a measuring utensil. So we're going to have to figure out what's the difference between the two. Wait till the Gemara to get there. Now they bring Ma'aseh ba'Abba Shaul ben Butnit. Shaya memale midotav me'erev Yom Tov v'notnan le'lekochot beYom Tov. We're now going to use him as an example. Here, look what he used to do. He used to measure everything out, have it all measured before Yom Tov. So you see here, he owned a store. He would make sure before Yom Tov to do it all before Yom Tov, and then he would sell it to people on Yom Tov, right? He would give it to them, and obviously they would pay him back after the holiday. But the point is that he took care of any kind of measuring, as opposed to Tanakama, which seems to allow something. He took care of it all before Yom Tov. To which the Mishnah, there's two opinions in the Mishnah to explain Abba Shaul ben Butnit. Interestingly, one of them is Abba Shaul, who was not Abba Shaul ben Butnit. It was a different Abba Shaul. Okay, if you thought that name wasn't the most common, apparently two people had that name. Abba Shaul Omer, you misunderstood the situation. Af b'moed hayav sekin mipnei berurei hamidot. Abba Shaul ben Butnit would not do this in order to avoid measuring on Yom Tov. He did this even on Chol Hamoed. It wasn't an issue just on Yom Tov. It wasn't an issue of measuring on Yom Tov, because measuring you could do on Chol Hamoed. What was the issue? We're going to see in the Gemara, they say it's mishum bitul beit hamidrash. That on Yom Tov, on Chol Hamoed, he was busy more time in the Beit Midrash. Okay, Rashi explains this because people would ask him questions on Chol Hamoed, because a lot of people weren't working and they were more in the Beit Midrash, so they would have more questions to ask him. Some people say it just means he was learning on his own in the Beit Midrash. So what would he do? Since he spent most of his day, he didn't want to be in the store for very long. So when he would go to the store, he was a little bit hurrying so he could get back to the Beit Midrash. He worked, let's say, half days on Chol Hamoed, right? That's very common in Israel, not as much in Chutz La'aretz. But in Israel, people work half days on Chol Hamoed if they work, or all that. So he would work part days. Now what happens? People come in, and they bring him their utensils, or he measures it, let's say, in his measuring utensil. And when he measures it, there's a little bit of foam that appears from the wine. There's a layer of foam at the top. Now, if you wait a few minutes, the foam settles down, and then you get an exact measurement. But on Chol Hamoed, he was in a rush, because first of all, lots of people maybe were coming to the store on Chol Hamoed more, and also because he wanted to get back to the Beit Midrash. So what did he do? He measured everything the night before. He didn't want to sell it to you with the foam, because let's say, right, it's 100 milliliters, and then with the foam it's really only 80. So he didn't want to sell you for 100, right? The price for 100 when really it was only 80, right? He would wait till it settled, and then he'd add more wine. So he would do that all at night, so it had time to settle properly. So he wouldn't basically cheat anyone out of what they were paying for. But that's a totally different topic. It has absolutely nothing to do with measuring on Yom Tov. Chachamim Omrim, the rabbis had a different approach as to what Abba Shaul ben Butnit did and why he did it. And it wasn't only that he didn't do it on that he did it on the Yom Tov. It wasn't only that he did it on Chol Hamoed. Chachamim say af becholo sekin. He would do this all year long. Every day he would do the measuring the night before, because of mitzui hamidot. What's the issue? Okay, again, let's go back to our kitchen. When you measure oil in a measuring cup, then you pour it into your whatever you're making, there's always a little bit of oil at the bottom of the measuring cup, right? It never fully comes out. So Rashi explains that when he would sell oil, he would basically prepare. What happens is people would bring their jugs to the store, leave their jugs in the store. He would fill the jugs. He would leave it, and he'd measure in his measuring utensil, exactly how much. He'd pour it into their jug, and then he'd wait. He'd leave it kind of upside down so that all the last drops of oil would get in there, and he wouldn't cheat anyone out of it. So according to the rabbis, he did this every day, not just on Chol Hamoed and not just on Yom Tov. And again, either which interpretation you go with, the story of Abba Shaul ben Butnit has nothing to do with measuring on Yom Tov, okay, which is what we brought it for in the first place. So now the Gemara is going to go back to, and let's try to understand this machloket between Rabbi Yehuda and Tanakama here. So again, let's just read the words so that we understand where they're coming from. Tanakama says, Omer Adam lechavero maleli kli zeh. You could say, fill me up this utensil, but not bimidah, but not with measurement. And Rabbi Yehuda says, if it was a utensil that was used for measuring, it's a problem. So my avalo bimidah. So what did Tanakama mean here? Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Rav Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel. Aval, this is the first. We're going to see two interpretations, and then we're going to ask the exact same question on both interpretations. Aval lo b'kli hamiyuchad lemidah. Aval kli ha'omed lemidah yimal'enu. You can't use a kli that you normally use for measuring. That's not allowed. You can't say, fill me up in this utensil, even though you're not mentioning any sort of measurement, or let's say money, like we saw in the previous Mishnah. You say, fill me up in this utensil, but if that's the one that you always measure your things in, then you can't ask them for that. But kli ha'omed lemida yimalenu. If it's a kli that is meant for measuring, but you never used it for measuring. So it seems the commentaries explain that what's the situation? You have like a spare that you've never used before. For when your general one breaks, your usual one, you'll use that one, but you've never used it before. So according to Tanakama, when it says avalo b'midah, that means not the one you always use. But if it's meant for measuring, but you don't use it, you haven't yet used it once for measuring, then it's okay, as long as, again, what do you say? Again, look at the wording. Malay li klizet, right? Fill me up one of those. Or you don't say the measurement, even though it is for measuring, then it's an issue. So now, he says, right, but if it's new, then it's not a problem. Va'ata, I think I just said the opposite, right? I was saying this specifically is not a problem according to Tanakama, and that's where Rabbi Yehuda disagrees with him. Va'ata, Rabbi Yehuda l'meima, afilu kli ha'omed l'midah lo yimalena. Even if it's normally used for measuring, you can't fill it up. In other words, even if it's meant for measuring. If it was created as a measuring cup, even if you've never used it before, you cannot use it. Alma. Now, here comes the big conclusion, which no matter how we understand this Mishnah, it's a clear conclusion that comes out of our Mishnah. Alma gabe simchat Yom Tov, when it comes to simchat Yom Tov, and you want to go to the store and get your stuff, right? Who's more stringent here? Rabbi Yehuda. Right? Rabbi Yehuda l'chumra. But wait, we learned in yesterday's daf the opposite. It's not. And we had this exact type question in the beginning of the Masechah with Beit Hillel, Beit Shammai, right? We said, oh, what do you mean? Beit Shammai is more strict, but in the first Mishnah he was more lenient. And how can you say that? Same thing here. The assumption is we want to permit things for Simchat Yom Tov. So some people will permit all sorts of things that generally are problematic, whereas other people say, no, we can't permit these things, even though there's Simchat Yom Tov at stake, because you want to make sure you have oil or wine or whatever it is that you need for the holiday. So Amagav is Simchat Yom Tov, Rabbi Yehuda l'chumra, Rabbanan l'kula, and the opposite we learned on the previous daf. Ditnan, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Shokel Adam Basar Keneged Akli Keneged Akofitz. You can use your weights and measurings, right, as long as you don't use weights, but you can use your scale, I should have said it. You can use your scale as long as you put on the other side of the scale a utensil or a cleaver, as long as it's not the usual weights. You can't use weights, your measuring tools at all. You can't use your scale in any way. Doesn't matter what you're putting on it. So what do you see here? Alma Rabbi Yehuda l'kula v'Rabbanan l'chumra. On that issue, when it came to weighing, Rabbi Yehuda is more lenient and the rabbis are more strict. It seems weird that they would flip, here. So they say, right, kashi de Rabbi Yehuda and kashi de Rabbanan. Each of them doesn't make sense, right? If you take Rabbi Yehuda versus Rabbi Yehuda, the rabbis against the rabbis, they seem to have opposite approaches here. So de Rabbi Yehuda lo kasha. So let's start with Rabbi Yehuda. He's going to distinguish between the cases. Hatam b'she'eno omed l'midah. There, with the cleaver is not something that was meant to be used as a measuring, right? You didn't create the cleaver. It wasn't built for weights or measure, right? It's not why it's built. It was meant for cutting, right? And whatever utensil you use was meant for some other purpose, and you happen to be using it here. That's already a big difference. But but hacha be'omed l'midah. But here, it's true you've never used it before, but it was created as a vessel meant for measuring. It was a measuring utensil. So who cares whether you've used it or not used it? It's, right, again, the issue here and the issue throughout our daf today are really two issues. One is, it looks like uvdin dechol, it looks like something you do on a weekday. And number two, it looks like you're selling, right? We don't want to have things that appear, even though you are selling, you're trying to make it look like you're not really selling. Okay? So those are your issues. He basically says, so it's only going to be with utensils that were meant for measuring. That's a problem. If they weren't meant for measuring or weighing, if they weren't meant for that, like a cleaver or some other utensil, then you can use them. Now, de Rabbanan, nami lo kasha. Now remember, the rabbis in the cleaver didn't allow it. And in this case, they do allow it. So, how do we explain that? Hatam ka'avid keda'avdim bechol. Even though the cleaver wasn't meant for measuring or weighing, the fact is if you're in your store and you don't have your weights for whatever reason, People use that on a normal day. It is something that's commonly used. I was trying to think of an example. One didn't come to mind, but you have all sorts of things in your house that are not meant for a particular use, and yet you might commonly use them for that use. Okay? There's all sorts of things, right? That it's commonly used as that, even though it certainly wasn't the point of that was not to do the following. However, you do often use it. So that's what he says about the cleaver. Even though it's not meant for it, you do use it for that, right? If you're stuck in your store without, that is something people would use to weigh their meat. So therefore, since you do it normally on a weekday like that, therefore you can't do it on Yom Tov like that. Again, part of this is that we're allowing selling, which is a weird thing that we allow it, but we're going to allow it with a shinoi, as we say. You have to change from the way you do it normally. As long as you make some sort of indication that you're doing it different than normal, right? And here it's not different than normal. But hacha lo ka'ave keda'avdim b'chol. But this utensil that you've never used before, so you've never used it on a weekday, right? It's there in storage for when you might need it, but you've actually never used it on a weekday. So therefore, it'll be noticeable that you're doing something different. Okay, so that was all according to the first explanation, that the difference between them is a utensil that you've never used before. Okay, can you use that or not? Even though it was meant for measuring. But Rav has a different explanation. Rav amar, maya valo b'midah, shelo yizkor lo shem midah. You can't say, okay, again, it's your speech that's important, just like before with the meat. You can't say, I want a liter's worth of oil. Can't say that. But if it's a kliyam yuchad l'midah yimalenu, but if it's generally used for, right, you could say, I want that jug full of wine. But you can't say, I want a liter's jug full of wine. As long as you don't mention liter, that's already different. No, if it's meant for measuring, you can't use it. It doesn't matter whether you say it or don't say it. So again, same question. You see here Rabbi Yehuda's strict, and the rabbis are more lenient. And this we're going to go through quickly because it's the exact same thing we already said, but we saw the exact opposite in the Mishnah on the previous page. You can weigh it up against a cleaver or some other utensil. In that case, it's the reverse. The rabbis are strict and Rabbi Yehuda is more lenient. So again, kasha de Rabbi Yehuda and kasha de Rabbanan de Rabbanan, they each contradict each other, right? Each source, Rabbi Yehuda contradicts Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis contradict the rabbis. And then again, the Gemara says, Rabbi Yehuda lo kasha, it's not really difficult. Why? There again, the cleaver is not designated for measuring, so that we're weighing. Therefore, it's allowed. Here, the cleaver was designated for weighing, for measuring, so it's a problem. Rabbanan de Rabbanan nami lo kasha. Hatam ka'avi keda'avdim b'chol. There, again, the cleaver, you're using something that people would use on a normal day. But here, you're not really doing something you do on a weekday. Why? People often use, and this is interesting because this is not what we normally use it for, right? We don't do this anymore. But many people would give their friends a glass of wine in a measuring cup. Okay, they would use, right, this is interesting when you think about it, we have so many different things in our kitchens, right? We have measuring utensils, and then we have glasses, and we have wine glasses, and we have, right? They probably use all the same things. It was a cup, and the cup was also used for measuring, and it was also used for serving wine to their friends. So because of that, they would use this measuring cup to sometimes give their friends wine, and therefore you can also go to a store and get it from a storekeeper in that kli, according to the rabbis, because it's something that was normally done. It wasn't only used for measuring. So because of that, it's fine. Okay, as long as, again, you don't mention that you want a measurement, then it's okay. Maaseh ba'Abba Shaul ben Butnit. So now we want to get to this Maaseh, and again, what we learned from it, and we're going to get off a little bit on a tangent about something else about him that's connected. Tana af b'moed osekem b'pnei bitul beit midrash. This is what I already explained, that he would do it on a week. He would do it on the holiday in general, not just on Chag, but also on Chol Hamoed, because he didn't want to not be in the Beit Midrash. Again, this seems to imply, by the way, that people didn't study at nighttime. Right, nowadays, it's very common people study at night. Even the Rambam says the best time to learn is at night. But clearly, they didn't study at night, because at night he would do his weighing and his measuring out, and during the day he would be learning in the Beit Midrash or answering questions from people, etc. Tano Rabbanan, another braita about him. Despite the fact that he was super careful about this, okay, we're now going to see, and the story is clearly an exaggerated story. Hu kanas 300 karbei yayin miberurei hamidot. He gathered 300 barrels full of wine from all the extra foam. In other words, right, because of this, he had sold to people, even though he was careful. Let's say I gave an example before. It was 100 liters, and he would 100 milliliters, and he would sell 80 milliliters, right, because of the foam. So he'd let it settle so that wouldn't happen, and he would fill it up again and again and again. But still, there was a little bit of a differential here. And if you counted all that together, right, this is a good example of how a little bit can sometimes, right, if you measure up a little bit and all those times, you get to a ton. I just saw it on Facebook. Somebody posted something about he quit smoking, and he showed this app he was using to quit smoking, and it showed how much money he had saved, how much time he had saved from not smoking all those months, and the amount of time, right? You think about it, how long does it take? But all of that added up together adds up to a ton, and that's what they were trying to say here. Little bits can really add up to a lot. So, you might think he was a little crazy, but in the end, even though he was so crazy, still, all those little bits added up to 300 barrels of wine. And Chaverav, not only him, but his friends were like him. They kansu 300 karbei shemim mitzoi amidot. So from the oil, they would also, a little bit would remain, and they added up all those little amounts, and it came out to 300 barrels. Right? Thank you, Medina, for saying this. I was going to say it, and then I said, maybe I shouldn't do my own self-promoting my own stuff. But right, Daf Yomi is the same idea. Right? You learn a little bit a day, and you get to 7.5 years. So, anyway. What did they do? They went to the Gizbarim in Yerushalayim, and they said, the treasurers, they said, what are we supposed to do about this? We want to return this to people, but we have no idea who we took it from, right? I mean, people come into my store every day. There's a little bit for everybody. I have no idea what to do. They said, it's very nice you're being so whatever, but you don't really need to worry about this. Why not? Because you sold it to people. People knew when they buy it, they know that. I was thinking of those potato chip bags that are full of air, right? And you end up opening that. There's like very little potato chips inside. But you know that when you buy them, that's what's going to happen. So, obviously there you're buying by weight, and I don't know how it works, but sometimes you open and you're like, really? That's all that's in here? In fact, there's these crackers we buy in my house that my kids were complaining because they changed the packaging, and now instead of it, like there's much more plastic and much fewer crackers, and they're still charging the same amount. So like they really, changed it so that they could sell less and make the same amount of money on it. But the point is that as the buyer, we buy it and we know that. So, we basically, it's what we call mechila. We basically say, okay, fine. We know. We're giving up our rights to that. It's fine. It's not ours. We know you're taking a little extra, and that's just what's going to be. So, amru lahem af anu im ritzonenu b'kach. That's not good enough for us, though. We still want to return it. So what they say, amru lahem ho'il v'ichmartem al atzmachem asu mehem tzarchei rabim. If you really want, because you really want to be strict with yourself, fine. Use it for public things. Okay, we're going to see what that is in a minute. Like pay it back to the public. Ditanya, how do we know this? That this is what you're supposed to do? There's a braita that says exactly this. Gazal ve'eno yodea lemi gazal. If you stole from someone and you don't know from who you stole, you should put it toward public funds. So the Gemara says, what is that? Okay, which are the cisterns and the where they used to collect the water, basically for water reservoirs, because everybody benefits from water. So give it to water, and then everyone will benefit from it. Okay, this seems to mean that Rav Chisda gave permission. It means he caused him to speak. He gave permission for Rabbi Ukva to speak, like in the Beit Midrash maybe. V'darash, and Rabbi Ukva got up and he started to teach the following. Okay, we're again with our topic of measuring, moving on from Abba Shaul ben Butnit. Lo yimdod adam se'orim v'yiten lefnei behem to b'yom tov. By the way, I should just mention that Shuli Mishkan in Flashback today talks about weights and measurements and all that. It went up last night. I didn't have a chance to really read it, but it's definitely some background on our daf about weights and measurements, so worth reading. So he says, don't measure se'orim v'yiten lefnei behem tov b'yom tov. Okay, I saw, Medina, you asked before, is this just when you go into a store? So now we're going to see it's not just when you go into a store for buying and selling, but even if you want to go give your animal barley, you can't go measuring it. Okay, so now, aval, what can you do though? Kodel hu kavo kabayim v'noten lefnei behem tov ve'eno choshesh. So you can't, let's say, pour barley into a measuring cup and say, okay, I'm bringing this to my animal now. But what can you do? You can put a measuring cup that you know about how big it is, stick it, make a hole in your pile of barley, push it down, it'll fill up, and then you can give it to him again. Everything has to be done with some sort of shinui, change from the typical. Here's very important, and there's big debate among the poskim how to understand this. But a person who works, a nachtom is usually a baker. He's allowed to measure his spices out and put it in whatever he's cooking. Apparently he didn't just make bread, in order that he not ruin it, right? If you put too much chili powder, right, some of the people at your table are not going to eat the food. So if you don't measure things out, right, any spice really you can ruin by putting too much. So we allow you to measure it out so you don't ruin the cooked dish. So now, this is a whole big debate halachically. First of all, notice, this is only a nachtom, it says. So is this only a professional who's like selling their stuff maybe? Or can anyone do this? Are we allowed to measure stuff, right, like a general on Shabbat? You can't measure out with a measuring utensil. So can you on Yom Tov? It's a big question, and it's all about how you understand this. So you can do it if it's going to possibly ruin your... So then it's interesting. First of all, some people distinguish only maybe an expert rather than a homemaker, it's just in their house doing it. Maybe they can't. Some people say if you normally don't measure, then you specifically can't measure on Yom Tov, because if normally you just do it by estimation, then you can't say all of a sudden on Yom Tov I have to start measuring it out, right? There's some of us who cook by measuring everything exactly, and there's some of us who just pour stuff into our dish. So if you just pour stuff in, then you definitely can't measure on Yom Tov. If you normally measure, then maybe you can. Again, I'm not going to paskin. There's a debate about this halachically. I just saw that there was a debate. I'm not getting into how exactly we hold. Amar Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba Amarav modedet isha kemach b'Yom Tov v'notenet letochi sata. If you're making a dough, you can measure the flour, not for the reason that you think that so it comes out better. No, kedei shetitoch chala ba'ayin yafa. In those days, and this is different nowadays, and some people say, therefore, Tosfot mentions this, we don't hold this way nowadays, okay? But you can measure your flour because they would take 1 out of 24 for the kohen, the challah, that they would be separate. Nowadays, we just do it to remember. We don't do it the way we did it then because we don't give it to kohanim, and therefore we take a smaller amount and we burn it. But in those days, they measured 1 out of 24. So if you don't measure your flour, you're not going to necessarily give the right amount, and then you might mess up the kohen. So because of that, specifically because of that, we allow you to measure out your flour. Shmuel amar asur. Shmuel says you can't do this. Here's a very important line, and Gefet this week is all about this. It should go up sometime later today. V'hatana debei Shmuel mutal. But wait, in the house of Shmuel, he had a book of braitot, and in there it says that it's permitted. Amar Abaye. So how could it be that Shmuel said it's forbidden when his braita, he has a braita about this in his school, they teach this braita that it's permitted. So Amar Abaye, Hashta de Amar Shmuel asur, Vitana de Shmuel mutar. Since Shmuel says it's forbidden, even though the braita says it's permitted. Okay, here's the big line. Shmuel halacha l'maaseh atala shmuinan. He must be teaching us halacha l'maaseh. What does this mean? Like how we're supposed to act. So Rashi says what it means is, it's like we saw a few days ago, halacha ve'ein morin came. This is the halacha, but we don't teach people that you can do this, right? Because we're worried about the after effects. So even though his braita says it's mutal, he's telling people it's asur. And what Rashi explains, if you look at the Rashi on the bottom of Amud Aleph, the last Rashi, he says, I'm looking like 4 lines from the bottom, if somebody comes and asks a halachic question, you say you can't do it. That's what Shmuel would say. But if you see someone who does it, you won't stop him. Because halacha de mutal, because the halacha really is that it's permitted. It's a very strange thing, and this is why in Gefet this week they decided to talk about this, because it's a fascinating topic about how we hold la halacha, right? That sometimes, even though we think that this is the halacha, we don't necessarily teach people. That's Rashi's interpretation. Tosfot does not understand the sugya that way. And he actually thinks that what it's saying, when it says halacha l'maseh ata lashwinan, that he had a braita, but he disagreed with it. And he's coming to teach us the halacha. When he says asur, we go by that. When he brought a braita that says it's permitted, that was the braita, that was what he learned, but he obviously thought that it should be forbidden. And he disagreed with Rav, and he disagreed with the braita. And there's all sorts of interesting Tosfot. So listen to Gefet where they talk about this whole issue. And it really affects how we view halacha and psikat halacha. In other words, is there this concept, right? Tosfot, at least in this sugya, doesn't view it as, oh, there's a halacha, but we don't teach people. He understands it in a totally different way based on the Bahag and others. Anyway, it's an interesting question, how to read this. And it teaches you about how people decide halacha. Tanu Rabbanan. Ein shonim kemach b'Yom Tov. Okay, now we're switching topics. We were talking until now about buying and selling and all that kind of stuff. But what's similar is that these, again, we said if you do it somewhat differently than you normally do it, then it becomes permitted. So we're going to talk about another issue. Again, ochal nefesh, what's permitted? This goes back to what we talked in the beginning of the chapter. We kind of end the chapter the way we started with this topic about what things are permitted for ochal nefesh or not. So can you sift your flour? They're now going to talk a second time. The first time you can't really sift because Rashi says, again, matching the Rashi in the beginning of the chapter, which was you need to, if you could do it yesterday, then do it yesterday. Anything you could do from before Yom Tov should be done before Yom Tov. So sifting flour, for sure, you could have done before Yom Tov. The question is, can you do it a second time? Once you've already, what's the issue? The problem is separating the bad from the good, right? We're not allowed to do that on Shabbos, nor on Yom Tov, because again, assuming you hold Bishava Elach, again, there's two different ways of understanding this, as we saw in the beginning, which is maybe only certain things are allowed, not all the melachot are permitted for Ochal Nefesh, or again, whatever can be done from yesterday. But what if you want to sift it a second time, where we've already removed all the bad? The only thing we're trying to do is to improve the quality of the flour, right? The more it's sifted, the finer it is. And the finer it is, the better it is. So, can we do it a second time on Yom Tov to make the flour even better? So, according to the braita, Tanu Rabbanan, there's a machloket. Ein shonim kemach b'Yom Tov, but mishum Rabbi Papayas, Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera amru shonim. Shonim means to do it a second time. So, Tanakama says you can't run it through the sifter a second time. And that's again, the first time you did it before Yom Tov. Now you want to on Yom Tov do it a second time, you can't. But Rabbi Papayas and Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera says you can. Vishavim, they both agree, however, she'im nafal letochan schor o kesam sheshonim. If a rock or a twig falls into them, then you're allowed to take it out. Because that couldn't have done before Yom Tov. It wasn't there before Yom Tov, right? Something falls into it. So you can pull it out. Tane Tana Kameh de Ravina. So again on this topic, someone brings a braita before Ravina, and he says, Ein shonim kemach b'Yom Tov. You can't do this. However, aval nafal tzror o kesam borer biado. But if a rock or a twig or something falls into it, you can take it, but notice what he says, biyado, by hand. You can pull it out by hand. To which Ravina says to him, because he brought this in front of Ravina, Amarle, koshkin da'asur, dahavale kiborer. What do you mean? If any of these fall into your flour, think about it. What would you do? You pick it out with your hands, right? It's not something teeny that you need the sifter for. You can pull it out with your hands. So that's the typical way of doing it. That you can't do on Yom Tov, right? Normally, if you remember in Shabbat, we kept talking about anything you could do biyad is always going to be a little better if you do it by hand. But he says, that's basically taking out bad from good. That's the malacha of borer, to pull it out, and in this case, to do it with your hand is the typical way. He thinks specifically, if you put it in a sieve, that's an atypical manner of taking out its tzror or a kesam, and therefore do it in that way. Darash Rabba bar Rapuna Zutea Pitcha de Nahardea. He taught in the entrance to Nahardea. We're now going to see 3 cases. He taught people Shonim Kemach b'Yom Tov. You can sift your flour the second time on Yom Tov. Amarlu Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman reacts to what he says, not because he disagrees with him, but he says the following. It's very interesting. Puku va'amru leila Abba. He says to people, go out and tell Abba, which was his way of talking to Rabba bar Rapuna. People should go tell him, Shkila tivuta v'shadei achizrei. Go take all the good you think you're teaching here and throw it to the thorns, meaning this is totally useless what you're telling us. Why? Puk chaze kama mahulta hadron benahardea. Go see how many people are sifting their flour a second time. Hadron is to go again. Remember hadron alach. We're going to say it here and as soon as we finish the chapter today. Go back, right? Look how many people are going back, meaning they're doing it a second time. They're sifting their flour in a hardea. And you're getting up. This is like a great line in saying you're totally not in touch with reality. You're coming here and teaching this halacha that everybody already knows. Everybody's doing it. So what do you think you're coming and teaching something new? You can go throw it to the thorns. Totally useless what you're doing. Interestingly, he has this harsh reaction to him. I think really what he's saying is you're just not in touch with reality. Right? We never like it when people tell us you're supposed to do what you're already doing. Right? It doesn't make people feel good. It makes them feel like they don't, people aren't aware of what they're doing and that they know what they're talking about. Right? You never like to make people feel bad that they don't know what they're doing. So here, people don't even, right? You don't even know that we're doing things that we know what we're talking about. Debitu de Rabbi Yosef na la kimcha agaba de mahulta. The wife of Rabbi Yosef, right? This is always a good way to see halacha. Let's see what happened. Zoom into one rabbi's house. So his wife was sifting flour on the back of the sifter. She was doing it upside down, okay? Again, trying to do it with a shinoi. So Amar le chaza da'ana rifta ma'al yatabina. So Rabbi Yosef said to her, but I want really good flour. It's not going to come out so good this way because what's going to happen when you turn it upside down? It doesn't have a receptacle, so some's going to fall off the side, and my bread isn't going to taste so good. He says, no. Do it the right way because it's something that I want. I want the bread to taste extra good on Yom Tov. I'm allowing you to sift it the second time, even on Yom Tov, in a normal manner. So basically, he seems to say you don't need to do it with any sort of change. Amar le. Debitu de Rav Ashi na la kimcha agaba de ptura. She would sift her flour on the back of the table. This is a little unclear what this means. Does it mean they would turn the table upside down and it would serve as a receptacle? Does it mean that instead of sifting into a bowl, right, normally we'd sift into a bowl, they would sift onto the table? She would try to do some sort of change. Again, less of a change than the previous because she wouldn't turn her sifter upside down, but maybe she would just do it onto the table. Again, it's not exactly clear. Amarav Ashi Hadidam Barte de Rami Bar Chama. There's a mistake here in the text. It should be Rami Bar Abba. It's proven from a different place that's what he said is, my wife is the daughter of Rami Bar Abba, which is true. It was Rami Bar Abba, not Rami Bar Chama. Rami Bar Chama lived much earlier. It wouldn't make sense. So my daughter is the daughter of Rami Bar Abba. My wife is the daughter, and Rami Bar Abba Mara de Uvdahava. He must be the one who taught this. If she hadn't learned it from her father's house, there's no way she would have done this, and therefore he must have been the one who permitted it to be done in this manner, possibly permitted it with a smaller shinoi, or permitted it only if you do it with a shinoi. There's two kind of ways of understanding this. The commentary is split into two. Is this a kula or is it a chumrah? Okay, is it less of a shinoi than the previous one wanted to do, or more of a shinoi than nothing at all? You have to do some sort of change. Someone asked a question here on the chat, which is why did they not double sift it before Yom Tov? Because also it seems like something you could have done before Yom Tov. So I don't know the answer to that question. It could be that they wanted to freshly sift it, and that made it better. It could be that what they're saying is, even though you did, I think the way I understood the sugya is, even though you didn't do it before Yom Tov, it's not really a malacha. The malacha of sifting is really to get rid of, what's the whole thing of borer? It's to get rid of the psolet. In this case, you're not really trying to get rid of psolet, you're just trying to make the flour finer. You've already gotten rid of the psolet by putting it in the sifter the first time. So by putting it in the second time, you're just trying to refine it even more. That's already not a malacha. So that's why we're going to permit that on Yom Tov. That's the way I understood it. I could be wrong about it, but that's how I understood it. Okay, new Mishnah. Continuing with store owners and what you can buy. Here it seems to be go to someone you normally use, and this is because, again, if you normally use them, right, you'll be able to buy on commit, right? Buy, forget the word, on commission, or you'll pay later. Ve'omerlo, and you can say to him. Now, remember, we said you can't thank you on credit. That was the word I couldn't come up with. So we have this idea that you can't say. Remember, we said in the last one of the possible explanations of the Mishnah was don't say bimidah, right? You want a particular measurement of, and in the previous Mishnah was definitely clear where it said don't say you want a particular amount of money's worth, but you can say omerlo tenli beitzim ve'egozim b'binyan. You can say I want X number of eggs, I want X number of nuts. Okay, you can order things by number, by amount. Shekain derech balabayit liyot moneh b'toch beito, because that's how people do it in their house. Okay, the normal way of doing things in your house is to talk about things in numbers. Therefore, it's not necessarily something that's unique to a store. Tanu Rabbanan. Now we're just kind of a braita that goes into all sorts of things that you can order by amount, basically. Holech adam etzel ro'eh ragil. So you could go to a shepherd you usually go to buy your animals. Okay, you can ask for one kid or one lamb. Etzel tabacha ragil. So you could go to a normal butcher you used to. Give me one. I assume that people must change the spoonful. You don't usually ask for a spoonful from a butcher. It must be some sort of amount, or a yerech achad, or a leg, right? You can ask for a part of the animal. Maybe it means an arm. I assume that's what it must mean. It's a patam haragilat. So these are people who fatten chickens. V'omer lo ten li torah chad o gozal achad. I want one type of bird. It's a nachtom haragilat. So to a baker. V'omer lo ten li kikar achad o gluska achad. I want one loaf or one cake. It's a chambania ragil atzov omer lo ten lo 20 beitzim o 50 egozim 10 fartakim ב5 רימונים ואתרוג אחד. Okay, you can go to your local fruit store and say I want 20 eggs, 50 walnuts, 10 peaches, 5 pomegranates, and 1 etrog. Okay, you can go and do that. Ubevad shelo yazkir lo schul midah, as long as you don't mention the measure, the weight of it. Okay, which is interesting, right? When I go to a store, it's like funny. Many people order things in kilo. I want a kilo of tomatoes. For me, it's like I want 10 tomatoes. I don't know, kilo, how much weight. I don't go by weight, I go by number. But apparently most people went by weight and not by number, and therefore by number would be permitted. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer, the braita ends with, he adds a different opinion. He's worried more about the amount of money and not a kilo's worth or, a pound's worth. That doesn't bother him. It's the money that bothers him. And with that, Hadron alach ein sadim, and we will start with the first Mishnah in the next chapter, in the 4th parak. Hamevi kadei yayim mimakom lemakom lo yive'em besal ubekupa. Now we're going to talk about, this is what we say maybe also uvdin dechol, things you do on a normal weekday, things that seem to be also a tircha, it's like a big deal, it's work. We don't want you to do anything that's kind of work that seems like something you would do on a weekday. So if you're bringing jugs of wine from place to place, don't carry them in a basket or in a box, which is like a big box where people would, imagine you go buy a box of wine with 12 bottles in it. You can't start schlepping that on Yom Tov. Okay? Rashi says, Mishum dinir'eh k'ma'aseh chol, laseh masaot. It looks like you're doing a weekday activity of carrying loads. It's not something you do on Yom Tov. Aval mebihu al ktefo o lefanav. But you can carry jugs of wine on your shoulder or in front of you. If you want to carry teven, the hay or whatever it might be that you're going to use, your firewood, to burn your fire on Yom Tov or to give to your animals, straw. So lo yafshil takupala achorav, don't put it behind your back. Okay, I was thinking, once in a while, you might take a knapsack on Shabbat and it feels a little weird. Like a knapsack is something you normally wear on a weekday. You don't usually wear a knapsack, right? You might carry, I was going to make a joke, like a hadron bag, right? You might carry that on Shabbat, but you're not going to walk around with a knapsack on. So you can't walk with the teven on your back, because that's the way people normally carry a big load on their backs. Aval mevi'ahu biyado, but you can carry it in your hand, right? Like in that way. Umatchilim ba'arimat teven, aval lo be'etzim shebamuktzah. Now another issue with the straw. When you go to take straw for, again, whether you're giving to your animal to eat or you're going to make a fire, take it from you can take, actually this is for firewood. When you want to take a firewood, you can take straw from your pile of straw, but you can't take it be'etzim shebamuktzah. You can't take it, okay, this is all a question about what was set aside not to be used on Yom Tov that needs designation and what wasn't. So the assumption is, remember we talked about the muktzah, okay, and here the word muktzah appears. The muktzah we talked about was this area on the roof where they would dry out their fruits. There was also another area called the muktzah, which was behind their house, like in their backyard. They would store firewood for long periods of time. That's the assumption is in the muktzah is where you put things that you don't plan to use for a very long time. Whereas in the pile of straw, that's stuff that kind of comes and goes and you use That doesn't need any sort of designation from before. You're allowed to take from there, but don't take it from the Eitzim and the Muktzah, because those were designated, set aside as if you're not really going to use those, even on Yom Tov. So therefore, you can't take from there. And we're going to stop here, and we will get into all these cases more so tomorrow in tomorrow's shiur. Have a great day, everyone. We'll meet up tomorrow.